Welcome to the Industry of UX, number 6. Paul Pittman and I put together a series for folks that are interested in entering the UX world, for new UX designers, and for veterans that are interested in a different perspective. In this episode, we discuss our first UX jobs, the best mindset and attitude to have on your first UX gig, what it means to push back and to have backbone, and more. You can subscribe to the Industry of UX from your favorite podcast app, and you can check out theindustryofux.com for show notes, episode details, and to leave a comment and feedback. You can also support this podcast by making a donation or buying our new gorgeous-looking stickers on our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/theindustryofux. As always, let's dive right in with a question. Paul, what was your first job in UX?
That one is a good question. I started off obviously in development. I just want to give a little bit of backstory with the intent of focusing on UX. And that goes back to the conversation we had a couple episodes back when I talked about XAN. That was my very first job working in medical health and dental practitioner stuff. And that time, UX really wasn't a thing. Like nobody really knew about it. They knew it existed, and they knew they generally wanted to have it, but they didn't know what was entailed to actually do this within their company. So for me, when I first started getting into it, I did a natural transition from development right into design. So that helped me get a really strong foundation as well from the tech side of what would be needed to build out these experiences through UX. And that was actually a really good experience for me. I enjoyed it a lot because, being the first person in the room to talk about UX and advocate and educate and all that kind of stuff, it kind of gave me a lot of empowerment, and I really enjoyed it. That was my first experience, and that I did for about 2 years with that company when I first started. And I actually learned a lot from that. Being that we're one of the earlier innovators of UX, there were still a lot of things there that didn't have answers, especially to questions that were around users and research and that kind of stuff. So to me, I've just felt like a huge opportunity, major openings here to do a lot of really cool things, not just focus on the design aspect of things, but really to dive down and deep on the problem solving space. So my first job, what did I get out of it? I would say I got a lot of confidence because knowing that I was the first person in the company to build out a UX experience for customers before we went into code straight away was really great. So there's empowerment there. It allowed me to educate, build up confidence, have some backbone, understand how to speak with stakeholders, how to understand pushback and when to push back, when not to push back, all those types of things. It's even that back in the day, we didn't have a lot of these tools that we have today, which things like Figma and Sketch and all these other cool things that we could use. I was even using Photoshop to get some stuff done. And the reason why I was using Photoshop was it allowed me the ability to build out my own HTML, I guess you could say, prototype platform. So because I knew code so well, I was able to build a couple iframes that had iPhones as the background, and within inside that iframe I can actually create a prototype using just static images. So I would hop into Photoshop, for example, and then design my experiences, save these as images, and then upload them to a folder, and wherever that folder was pulling information, that would be shared out to everything. So I actually created thumbnails and workflows and everything else that required just the idea of having one image to understand that here's a workflow, here's how we could test things, and then here's a prototype. That was my first experience out of that. And what I also got too was just the ability to sort of get on it. That was one of the things one of the words I use a lot in my first job was just getting on it. It basically means in Amazon days, it's kind of like the same thing as saying bias for action, or Nike's just do it kind of thinking. And that was one of the major takeaways when I first started that. And in today's experience, that has not really changed on that thinking. It's just that it's become a little bit more easier and efficient to apply UX.
So you mentioned that one of the things that you learned is pushing back and having backbone. Mm-hmm. Can you define a little bit what it means to push back and have backbone, and why it happens in UX and why it's so important to do that?
Yeah. So, and that level of pushback can happen in all kinds of different levels, right? For example, you might have a conversation when someone thinks a feature that you're trying to design for is actually a lot easier, a lot smaller in scale than it is to solve for. And my levels of pushback really come in the idea of like, no, there's a little bit more involved in that. And if we don't do this, we're going to miss out on this. Meaning that if we don't solve for this problem first, we are not going to be able to put in this new initiative. That's where a lot of my pushback comes today, because what that does to your stakeholders is they're not expecting it, right? So they're looking at, hey, let's fix this problem that we know is broken. And from me, it's like, yeah, we do definitely need to fix that, but we can't fix that without fixing this, right? And that's where they're like, well, we're not willing to fix that. Then I'm pushing back and saying, well, we should fix that, or else, how are they going to, for example, an example I can give you is you'll hear the word ingress a lot, and meaning that how does one person get from one place to the next? Like if they're ingressing from one page to another page, what does that look like? Now, what happens to me on a lot of my pushbacks is that we're already focusing on the past tense. So they've already ingressed to this page, but then how do we design this feature that looks great, but then nobody knows exists unless we fix the ingress point, right? And that's something I run into a lot in my pushback. So then it becomes a bit of a pivot where we either have to realign on what we need to address, or we don't address it at all, right? And that's where having Backbone, disagree and commit comes into play. So Amazon does have that LP, where you'll run into a situation like I just explained, where you're
LP
like,
being leadership principle, right?
yeah, sorry, LP being a leadership principle at Amazon. So, I'll have a disagree and commit and say, okay, I understand you want to fix this solution, even though they may have a hard time finding this solution, coming from these other places that they're coming from. But if you want to fix this now, then I will disagree and commit and fix this. But let's make an argument to come back and fix the ingress, because without that, you don't have two pieces of the puzzle connecting. You only have one piece of it. And I usually do okay with that. What happens sometimes is that, you want to squeeze that into the roadmap, and when you do try and get that onto the roadmap, then it's always parent, right? Rather than just having a conversation around it. So knowing that, my pushback, I don't back down very easily. Right. So if I know I'm going to be disagreeing and commit, I want to have a backup plan. And that is to surface this either on a roadmap or as a P1, phase 1, phase 2 initiative. And then I will make a case around that.
What happens when you push back and you use your backbone to make a case like the one that you mentioned about ingress, and then nothing happens? What is your next step? I know that this lays out 1,000 different ways of going about it, and I'm not necessarily looking for a particular one, but I'm saying for folks out there that pushed back in the past and they just got a big fat no.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a
What's
good
the next
question.
step?
Yep, next step, bring in data. So even you should be bringing data from the very beginning anyways, but always surface that data throughout the entire conversation. And now to go back and see if you can execute on those initiatives, that's always a challenge, right? And that is basically part of your job as a UXer, and you'll hear this word a lot, is to have that level of empathy and advocacy. If you can execute on that, meaning always have those conversations going, push them forward, if you can get a level of commitment during the initial initiative to work on the second one, that's something that you can do during the time that you're designing for that first initiative. So basically the one I was talking about is the one that's after ingress, right? If you can get a commitment there to say, look, we still need to surface this and fix that, that comes in different tones of conversation, right? One is you can queue yourself up with a developer who can start advocating for you as well. You can start dealing with your TPMs and your PMs to start advocating for that as well. So this is an interesting question, because it's not like there's a something that you can learn how to do this. This is something that you build with your stakeholders, and that's trust. And if you can start building a level of trust, then you will start understanding that these individuals will advocate for you on these solutions. So you can't just be the single voice in the room, right? And that type of thing happens over time. It's not something that you get just because you've joined a company and you're a UX designer that they're going to listen to everything that you say. There's still a level of trust that has to be established. So to me, that takes some time, and that's one approach that I take, because they will speak up and talk about it on your behalf when you're not there, because they trust that what you're providing is the right solution. Does that answer some of that?
Oh yeah, plenty.
Yeah. Okay.
And to add on top of that, I will say that case studies could also be pieces of information that you bring in. And case studies need to be tailored to the company you're working on. So if you can build a case study with something that already happened in the company you're working for, and maybe something that the stakeholders are already familiar about, something that, let's say you bring in a case study about a process that happened and it wasn't UX led, or there was no UX applied to it. And then when UX finally was applied to it, the results were improved based on the KPIs that you're tracking. These type of case studies are really going to be your friend and valuable when you're trying to pitch something. However, I will say this: if you really need that stakeholder validation to move forward with a project, because not everyone does, but for those of you out there that need that stakeholder stamp of approval, the best thing that you do as a UX designer, or you can do, is provide options and show, as Paul mentioned, bring in the data, show the options, show how UX is really going to impact the final product. And then the decision is sometimes out of your hands. So you can make the best recommendation, but if they still decide not to go with it, either you accept the decision and still work in some of your UX maybe partnering with the developers, partnering with the project managers, and really, as Paul mentioned, creating these partnerships and this trust that then is going to trickle to the stakeholders. Or you can quit. You can decide not to not to work on it, but then and just wash your hands of it, and just say, not necessarily wash your hands of it, but just say, no, if you're not considering my UX, I'm going to quit. But that's not a good attitude to have. That's not an inclusive attitude. That's not something that is going to change their mind in the long term. So see what you can do there. Play around with experimentations, which is something that we don't do enough in UX and we should be doing way more. But I think that this could almost warrant a separate episode, because there is a lot that we could talk about situations where, and I mentioned it, I had a conversation with Kelly Lucas last week, and that's going to be episode number 7. So it's going to come out right after this one. And we talked about turning a stakeholder no into a yes, but. So when folks tell you no, don't just accept that as an answer, but really find out why they're telling you no, because it could be something that you can actually work with or against and work around it to still be a user advocate and still bring your users into the fold somehow. So it doesn't have to be a no. In fact, I will argue that most no's are just yes, buts, right? I don't know the difference between a yes and or a yes but I like to use yes but because you really, bring in the point of it's a yes, but with this, when these conditions are true, then it's a yes. So I can work with those conditions, even if it's just a flimsy one, right? Anyways, going back to the main point of the episode for today, speaking about my initial UX job. So my very, very first UX job was the last job that I had in Italy before moving to the US. And I know this is going to sound like a total stereotype. Essentially, I was hired as a UI UX designer for this company that was a high quality food and wine distributor. And we were working out of a wing of a castle. So talking about stereotypical, I mean, that's as stereotypical as it gets. Working in Italy for a food and wine company which HQ is a part of a castle, right? So I was working in one of the towers. I was at the top floor, and it sucked during summers because we didn't have any AC. And as you know, the higher you are in a building in the summer, the hotter it gets. So yeah, but essentially my job there was to, as the sole the sole designer, actually, when I started the position, was really to do everything, organize photo shoots, make sure that the photographer knew what to put, to work the compositions, and then take those photos and publish them on the website, and then design the website, design the catalogs, talk to the customers, sometimes also work in the store because the HQ, the offices were on top of a showroom and store. So sometimes I had to go down there and work in customer service. So that definitely made me empathize with the customers a lot. And then I started building my own little team. I hired an extra designer. I hired a couple of developers. I hired a photographer. So it really gave me some room to grow. So it was really interesting how we were very entrepreneur led, I guess, meaning that the CEO was very micromanaging and it was literally telling me what to do and how to do it. And I was in a position where I did not use my backbone, as you mentioned before, Paul. And this is why it ties so beautifully with everything we just said, is that I was pretty much a yes man or a yes designer. Call it whatever you want to call
Yes,
it.
man.
So yes, exactly. So I pretty much will do anything that the entrepreneur, that the owner of the company will ask me or tell me to do. So design wise, I was really not pushing back that much. My designs were not user centric, they were CEO centric. And what I learned there, the things that I took away is really the big one being not be afraid to push back. Because at the end of the day, yes, the CEO should absolutely have a say in what happens at the company, because they are the ones that are spending the money on it, and they do have a say, absolutely. But I did not bring data. I did not bring expertise, best practices. I would just do anything that he would tell me to do. And I could see that by not speaking up my mind, I had ideas that really could have helped the company. It really could have helped the customers. It really could have helped my position in the company. So it would have been a win-win, but I just was too afraid to say no or to just push back. That's really the position that triggered me into being the best user advocate I can possibly be. And I mean, there are other little takeaways that I took here and there, such as you can't eat prosciutto and bread for lunch on a consistent basis and not expect to gain a considerable amount of weight. So that's one of them. We had the prosciutto right there in the shop, so I would just help myself to it, and the CEO was okay with it, so nobody was stopping me. But yeah, so
I mean that comes down also to storytelling as well. Like when you look at that, it's an idea of like we're not just focusing on chapter 4 without understanding chapter 2 or 3. We have to have a story written here, and that's one of the things when you look at pushing back is to make sure that you have a really good narrative, because without that narrative, you're basically just sort of adding things when you need to add them without really understanding, like in the UX term, the end-to-end state on something. Sometimes too, that's helpful when you try and get that pushback, is to not just walk in there with like an arsenal of data, but to also walk in there with a narrative. And starting that narrative, if that means going back a couple of chapters, are we still telling the same story? That will also help with some understanding, because even on a stakeholder end, in no matter who you're speaking with, they still are visual. Like they still want to see some level of visualization with all of this, right? So even though when you have those conversations, setting that kind of tone from the beginning to realize, you know what, actually we're not telling the same story anymore. Maybe we need to look at something, or maybe even change what we're working on today to suit our current narrative, even though we're not telling the best story.
do you have a story to bring up about how you learned about this storytelling piece? Do you have an example that you can bring up where you used it?
Let me think here for a minute. So yeah, we can talk a little bit about that. So one of the big storytelling features that we always talk about, and I'm sure Filippo, you run across it a lot, is, being mobile driven, right? So going mobile first versus desktop and being native and all that kind of stuff. So there's a level of storytelling there that happens, right? So meaning that even though we want to be mobile first, we still need that cohesive story to be told the same way on desktop as it is on mobile, and that we're not skipping over things for the sake of skipping over things. And that story can be the same story, but it could be read differently, meaning that even though on desktop you see things placed in a certain way, in a certain manner, that narrative is displayed in that format because that's how desktop is used, right? You have a mouse, you have a big screen, you can have multiple screens, you have a keyboard, so on and so forth, right? Whereas mobile, you have a device, right? And you're using your thumbs and you're scrolling and your fingers to interact on stuff. So when I try and put together a story, I'm trying to tie in desktop versus mobile as a complete story without skipping over chapters, right? And that is to keep things consistent on the design level. So even though we can get some pushback on focusing on certain things first over, let's say we want to fix this on desktop first before we fix it on mobile, well, we're now breaking the narrative, right? And then that's where you can start looking at some pushback as well. And what happens there sometimes is that it's not so much that that responsibility lies on one team, but you could be dealing with multiple teams, right? Which we run into today a lot. So you could have people who work specifically for mobile, specifically on desktop, on a specific page, on a specific feature, right? So there's all of those things that kind of go along with that. So when you're trying to tell that story and you want to make sure that that narrative is consistent, there's a lot of conversations that are happening to make sure that that happens. So for me, I deal with that today without a doubt every single day. And I'm still trying to figure out still who are these stakeholders that I need to reach out to, especially in my case where I work with Amazon and I'm integrating myself with Zappos. I'm still trying to figure out that landscape. And sometimes we bring in people into the conversation that we shouldn't be bringing into the conversation. And they're there just because we asked them, but maybe this isn't the right person, right? We have that. I'm going through that actually currently today, and I'm figuring out how do I have that kind of conversation and say, thanks a lot for showing up, but quite the person that we want to talk to, but thanks a lot. So to me, that happens day to day. And how you deal with that is really something that, again, it kind of goes back to two things for me, being that subject matter expert and understanding what's in play here as you tell the story. And then the second bit is that earns trust side of things, where you can explain that narrative and let people see that whole story and see like, okay, yeah, actually, you know what? I get it. This makes sense. And I believe what you're saying is correct.
So I think that's a great point. And we keep talking about stakeholders like they are this entity that floats around in the sky and we need to please them, like it's almost like a set of divinities or gods. But who are the stakeholders that we're talking about? And I'm not necessarily asking you to pinpoint all the roles that the stakeholders take in a specific initiative, but who are the stakeholders? When you start a project, what should you be thinking about when you think about stakeholders?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So to me, when I think of stakeholders, is anybody who's going to have hands-on on building this application, right? So in our case, this could be senior development managers. This could be developers themselves. We call them SDEs, which are software development engineers. And then, there's other TPMs that understand the technical aspect of these things. And even with just those three subsets, those could be more than one individual. You could have multiple developers. You could have more than one SDM. You could have more than one TPM, right? And then, if we're lucky enough to get a PM or a product manager, those individuals will be part of that stakeholder realm as well. Now, when you look at upper leadership, they are actually the directing what initiatives we should be working on. They are a level of stakeholder, but you wouldn't really engage them as a UX because they're coming up with the initiatives that we think we need to solve for based on business. Right? And then that's where I think a lot of pushback comes back from your stakeholders that you do work closely with, is because those initiatives are coming from top level. Right? And that means if you push back on them, they need to push back at top level, right? So keeping that in mind. And then on top of that, other stakeholders, if you're working collaboratively with other designers, there could be other designers as well. Like I believe in accessibility, so I work closely with an accessibility designer at Zappos to make sure that I'm trying to hit those marks as well. And then, I surface those other stakeholders that I'm working with to get in touch with that person as well on the accessibility level, so that we have that going on. So, and then, so you can have that, you can have maybe even another UX designer that's specifically on mobile and you're only focused on desktop. That could be another stakeholder. And that means, again, you could have more than one type.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But going back to the original spirit of the episode, let me ask you, what is the best attitude and mindset to have on your first UX job?
Yeah, awesome question. First thing first, get to know those who you need to speak to. Number one, find out who it is that you're talking to or need to talk to. At Amazon, we have something called Embark, and that structured is basically an online structuring tool that allows your manager to say, here's the stakeholders, these are individuals you need to speak to. They might even not even be on your team, but you need to speak to them anyways, just for some education to understand what's going on about a feature and that kind of stuff. So that's number one for me. And then build those ties, right? And understand not that you're coming in just on the UX aspect, but you're also coming in as a listener. So that goes to my number 2 point, which is understand the material, right? Don't just jump into the idea that you're going to come up with a solution tomorrow. You need to understand the subject and under the material and understand everything that you need to understand about what's happening. I mean, just that part alone, getting ramped up will take some time. The bigger the organization, the longer it will take because there's a whole bunch going on there, right? And then third is start your regular cadences with those people that you need to check in with so that you are making sure that you're not missing anything and that you're always on track for something. And that cadence could be around anything. It could be with your manager, it could be with a developer, it could be with anybody that you think you need to align with on a regular basis so that you can understand that you're always in the loop of what's happening, right? Because that's the number three is a trickier one, because those water cooler conversations, especially with today's conditions where everybody's remote, are harder to have, which means there could be conversations happening in fly that you don't even know. But if you know that they're happening and who's having the conversations, if you start establishing a regular cadence, then you will be able to understand or get insight on those conversations as opposed to not at all, even though you might find things late. And then what that does too is that that will still help having those individuals reach out to you directly, even before your regular cadence, to say, hey, by the way, this is what I just talked to somebody about this. And what do you think of this? Or this is not necessary to deal with today, but we can talk about it when we sync up next week, that kind of thing. So those are my top three. And then as far as like, I think designing goes, the tools, yeah, I mean, everybody kind of focuses a lot on those tools, but at Amazon, there's a lot of internal tools, so get comfortable with those. I'm not sure for every organization if they're using third party most of the time, but Amazon does protect their data and they're really sensitive to customers. So they have things internally that are not used externally. So understand those tools, right? You're going to come in with your own plethora of tools, which is probably like Sketch or Figma or Envision, whatever those tools are. But there are some companies out there that actually have their own internal systems. And even some of these tools that you might be used to using might behave differently within an organization. Envision, for example, you can have a downloadable desktop version or you can have a cloud version. And those experiences are actually quite different, right? And there's reasons behind why you would have a cloud version versus not, right? And that would probably be the last thing on all of that. And then once you get familiar, just starting with that, the rest of the things that will occur, I can't tell you because I don't have a crystal ball for that, but at least you set down a general foundation of understanding. And the understanding is the key word here because, you're going to feel much more equipped now. Then once you become sort of in that space and you do that regularly, things will come to you second nature. And that will probably happen over time. But then once you get to that state, conversations and anything else that happens outside of that, that's just going to happen organically. And at least you'll have some level of preparation for those times.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Something else that I wanted to speak about that kind of reinforces what you just mentioned is understanding the relationships that you have to have in order for you to do your job right. So start setting those one-on-ones, start understanding like who you should have a regular cadence of one-on-ones with, who are you going to be working with. So understand your team, and bringing people to lunch never really hurts. In fact, you can have meaningful conversations at lunch because you don't necessarily have to be that formal. You can also talk about anything else because remember that these are people, right? So these are not robots that happen to have a job where you're working at. So it's good to know them as people, and it's good for them to know you as a person. So you're going to be able to understand and be part of the culture much faster if you start bringing in these food events. I'm not calling them food events, but essentially people tend to be very informal around food. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is that if you happen to have taken any of the Springboard courses or any other boot camp on UX or any other course on UX, understand this. Those are meant to be taught in a linear progression where you go through the perfect steps from empathizing to launching what you have designed. So those are great steps to know, and those are great processes to have laid out linearly in your head. However, when you actually work in a job, those processes don't necessarily happen in a linear way, meaning that depending on the stakeholders, the project type, how much information you have, the deadline, and all of that, some of these processes might actually happen a little bit backwards, a little bit sideways, a little bit, going back and forth. So be very flexible in how you apply these processes. In fact, I will go as far as saying that if you can distill principles out of these processes and keep the principles strong, then the process can adapt based on the principles and the information that you're given to do your job. If you always try to follow a strict process, a strict linear process, eventually it's going to be kind of holding you back in your job, because if you if you're at a step, say 3, you don't have a key ingredient to move to step 4, you're going to get stuck. But if you have the principles of step 4 in your head, you can start moving around with some of it, or you can go back to step 2, or because you have these principles in your head, you know what's good for the users and you know what's good for the company. You don't necessarily are chained into a linear process, but you can actually move around like a squiggly line. And I think that that's really important. Mm-hmm. And anything else, I think, Paul, you brought up great points. I think that this is really a great attitude to have on your first UX job.
Totally agree. And that will, that also will help you leverage, advocates, like stakeholder advocates, when they are looking at you for promotion. Right? So even if you're coming in as a junior and you start taking on that mindset of ownership like that will help leverage you sort of get to the next step in your career as well.
And that's the end of my chat with Paul. Thank you so much for listening. You can subscribe to the Industry of UX from your favorite podcast app. And you can check out theindustryofux.com for show notes, episode details, and to leave comments and feedback. You can also support this podcast with a small donation or by buying our new gorgeous looking stickers on our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/theindustryofux. Thank you so much for listening again, and I hope you have a great day.